Okay, let's dive into something pretty heavy today, a connection that just keeps popping up in history.
Right.
You've definitely heard it. I mean, it's almost a default assumption for some. Was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, somehow the intellectual architect, the philosophical inspiration for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis?
It's such a persistent image, isn't it? And a really uncomfortable one. This
Yeah.
idea that Nietzsche's uh, really powerful, sometimes radical ideas might have sort of paved the way for that kind of tyranny.
Yeah, for the genocide, the war, all of it. It feels like such a dark shadow over his work.
And that's the core question for this deep dive, really. Using the source material we have, which is drawn from a pretty detailed lecture on this exact topic, we want to unpack whether his philosophy genuinely, inspired that inhumanity.
Or was something else going on? Like, why were the Nazis so keen to associate themselves with him?
Exactly, because that common perception, it links this major philosophical mind, known for critiquing morality, culture, everything,
Yeah, challenging everything.
with a regime that represents just, well, absolute monstrosity. So our mission here is to use the source to peel back those layers.
Mhm.
Was it real philosophical guidance? Or maybe something more manipulative?
Something much more calculated.
And just setting the stage quickly, the timeline itself is interesting. Nietzsche, the philosopher, he did his major work in the late 1800s. He actually died in 1900.
Okay, 1900.
Hitler, on the other hand, he founded the Nazi Party way later, 1919, and only came to power in 1933.
So Nietzsche was gone. I mean, he was actually incapacitated by illness from 1889, right? And dead years before the Nazi Party even exists, right?
Precisely, over a decade before, which immediately makes you think, well, how could he be directly guiding Hitler or the movement?
Hmm.
Seems unlikely.
Right.
And that's exactly where our source starts digging in. It challenges that whole idea of direct influence head on. It asks the basic question, is there any proof Hitler actually read Nietzsche? Like, properly engaged with his philosophy?
Did he grapple with the text in a way that shaped his own thinking?
And the source, well, it makes a pretty strong case against that idea. It points to a really specific moment, documented in 1935.
Okay, 1935. Nazis earn on power.
Right. Leni Riefenstahl, the filmmaker, was making Triumph of the Will, that infamous propaganda film,
Yeah.
and she was spending time with Hitler. Apparently, she asked him directly about Nietzsche, about his reading.
She just asked him straight up, what did he say?
According to the source, Hitler's response was incredibly blunt, almost dismissive. He said, this quoting the source quoting him, "Nietzsche is useless to me. He is not my guide."
Useless to me. He is not my guide.
Wow, that's not what you expect if he was claiming some kind of philosophical debt, is it?
Not at all. It's a flat-out rejection. Suggests he just didn't see Nietzsche's work as relevant or maybe even compatible with his own twisted worldview.
So that direct quote from Hitler himself in the middle of the Nazi era, that's pretty significant evidence against direct influence. The source certainly argues it is. Very powerful evidence. But it doesn't stop there. The source also brings up Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf.
Which he wrote much earlier, right? Back in 1924, before taking power, but after, well, forming his core ideas.
Exactly. And according to the source, Mein Kampf actually mentions other German philosophers who were kind of floating around in the intellectual air at the time.
Like who?
Notably, Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, the will driving life. Hitler mentions him.
Okay, so he mentioned Schopenhauer.
But the source states very clearly, there is absolutely no mention of Friedrich Nietzsche anywhere in Mein Kampf. Zero.
So the man himself, first in his big book laying out his ideology, he ignores Nietzsche. Then later, when asked point blank, he calls him useless.
That's the conclusion the source draws from these 2 points. It argues the most likely thing is Hitler either just didn't read Nietzsche at all, or maybe he skimmed something, found it irrelevant, and just dismissed it.
Not useful for his project.
Right. So the source suggests it's highly improbable that there was any significant direct philosophical influence from Nietzsche on Hitler personally.
Okay, but that creates a massive puzzle then, doesn't it? If Hitler wasn't reading him, wasn't influenced, called him useless, how on earth did this connection, this idea that Nietzsche was basically the philosopher of Nazism, get so widespread, so stuck in people's minds?
It's still around today.
Yeah. How does that happen if the main guy supposedly rejects the influence?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where the source shifts gears. It moves from the lack of direct influence on Hitler to the deliberate creation of a link by the Nazi regime itself.
Ah, so it was manufactured.
Exactly. The source argues the reason for this sort of constructed connection
Yeah.
is a common tactic for tyrants.
They need justification, like philosophical cover.
Precisely. The source puts it like this. Dictators, especially ones doing really brutal things, they crave legitimacy. They want some kind of intellectual backing, even if it's totally faked.
To make it seem like it's not just their own cruelty driving things.
Right. They want to be able to say, look, it's not just us. Our great philosopher said this was necessary. He justifies what we're doing. It shifts the blame, gives it a veneer of intellectual depth.
Makes their barbarity seem like high-minded philosophy.
Exactly. And the source gives other examples to show this isn't unique to Hitler. It mentions Mussolini in Italy.
Hitler's fascist counterpart.
Right. The source says Mussolini's ideology drew, at least partly, on bits and pieces of Hegel's philosophy. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, another giant of German thought.
Hegel. How did they use Hegel for fascism? His ideas are complex about the state, history.
Well, that's the point. Authoritarian regimes often grab onto certain bits, maybe Hegel's emphasis on the state, for example, and twist them, ignore the rest, just to give their rules some kind of intellectual gloss. Selective reading or misreading.
Okay, so selective borrowing. The source has another example, though, right? One that's maybe even more chilling.
Yes, it talks about Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, a regime responsible for, unimaginable death and suffering.
Millions killed under Stalin.
And the source states that Stalin actually tried to justify his atrocities, the purges, the gulags, the famines, using the name of Karl Marx.
Karl Marx, the guy who critiqued capitalism and talked about equality for the working class. How does that connect to mass murder?
It doesn't. Fundamentally, that's what's so horrifying. According to the source, Marx's whole philosophy at its core was about ending exploitation, creating a fairer society, focused on the oppressed.
The opposite of Stalin's terror.
Completely. But Stalin, driven by, paranoia and this insane lust for power, killed millions, not because Marx told him to, but to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat. Yet he used Marx's name, Marx's legacy, as a kind of shield. The Force uses this to show how dictators hijack famous thinkers, twist their names completely, to justify things the thinker likely would have abhorred.
So using the name tells you more about the dictator's needs than the philosopher's ideas.
Exactly. It's about the dictator needing that false justification. Which brings us back to Hitler and Nietzsche. Why Nietzsche?
Yeah, why him specifically?
Because, as the source explains, by the early 20th century, Nietzsche was huge. His ideas were incredibly influential, really popular, not just with intellectuals, but increasingly with the general public in Germany.
Concepts like the will to power, the Übermensch, people knew the terms even if they didn't fully grasp the philosophy.
Precisely. They were provocative, widely discussed, often misunderstood. And that popularity, that name recognition, made Nietzsche a super valuable asset for Nazi propaganda. They could tap into that existing fame.
It was strategic branding almost. Less about philosophy, more about leveraging a popular, slightly dangerous-sounding name.
That's exactly how the source portrays it. Not looking for a guide, looking for a brand to co-opt. And the source details the specific tactics, the concrete things the Nazis did to forge this link in people's minds. These weren't accidents.
Okay, let's break those down. What were these tactics?
Well, first, like we mentioned, that film title, Triumph of the Will, 1935.
Right, and Nietzsche had a famous work called The Will to Power.
Exactly. Now, The Will to Power wasn't actually a finished book by Nietzsche himself.
No.
We'll get to that. His sister compiled it. But the title was very well known. The source is clear.
Yeah.
The similarity between Triumph of the Will and The Will to Power was absolutely intentional.
A deliberate echo.
A deliberate linguistic link, designed to make audiences immediately connect Hitler's regime with Nietzsche's famous phrase. Simple, but effective branding.
Just borrowing that intellectual weight through the title.
Yep. But maybe even more powerful, according to the source, was that photo opportunity in 1933, just after Hitler took power.
The visit to the Nietzsche archives in Weimar.
That's the one. And a photograph from that visit was circulated everywhere. You've probably seen it.
Yeah, Hitler looking intently at a bust of Nietzsche, standing near Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth. It looks very significant.
And that was the whole point. The source calls it a powerful visual symbol, carefully staged to suggest closeness, like Hitler was paying respects to his intellectual forefather or getting his blessing posthumously.
Even though Nietzsche was long dead and Hitler supposedly found him useless.
Precisely. The photo created this image of connection of shared ideals, regardless of the reality. It became pure propaganda.
So the photo itself was step one. What came next?
Well, the Nazis didn't just let the photo sit there. According to the source, They built a specific narrative around it. After that 1933 visit, the picture went public, they actively started promoting an idea to the German people
Which was?
that Adolf Hitler was the superhuman, the Übermensch, that Nietzsche had supposedly predicted.
Whoa. So they took Nietzsche's complex philosophical concept and just slapped it onto Hitler as a political label.
Directly. The source explains they told the German public. This world-changing figure Nietzsche wrote about, the powerful individual who creates new values, asserts his will, crushes the weak that life. They twisted Nietzsche's metaphors here. That guy has arrived. And it's Adolf Hitler.
And the implication being?
The implication being, since Hitler is this prophesied Übermensch, exercising the will to power, again, their twisted version, it's everyone's duty to follow him, support the Nazi Party, without question. This narrative linked directly back to that photo op, using the public's vague awareness of Nietzsche's terms.
So the visit wasn't just a passive event. It was the launchpad for a state-sponsored story twisting Nietzsche for political gain.
Exactly. And one more detail from that 1933 visit the source highlights, something symbolic happened.
What was that?
Nietzsche's elderly sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, gave Hitler a gift, her brother's famous walking cane.
The philosopher's cane, given to the dictator. That image is incredibly loaded.
It really is. The source looks back at this as a hugely symbolic political act. I mean, gift-giving happens, but this gift, from the keeper of the archive at that moment, designed to link the two. It felt like a handover.
Like she was saying, here, take his legacy, use his image.
That's the interpretation the source suggests. A symbolic granting of permission for Hitler to use Nietzsche's legacy however he wanted. It added a personal, tangible link to the manufactured connection.
And this brings us squarely to this sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. The source really doesn't pull punches about her, does it? Calls her dangerous, a villainous character in this whole story.
Yeah, the source paints a very, very negative picture of her, and it's central to understanding how Nietzsche got tangled up with the Nazis. Her background is key. She was vehemently anti-Semitic, virulently so.
And she married someone similar.
Yes, Bernhard Förster, who was deeply involved in anti-Semitic politics at the time. The source mentions he openly advocated for killing Jews or kicking them out of Germany.
So extreme views actively promoted.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth shared them. They even tried, get this, to establish an anti-Semitic, pure German colony in Paraguay called New Germany, Nueva Germania.
A racially pure colony in South America.
Yeah. The idea was a society completely free of Jewish influence. The source notes, rather dryly, that the whole venture was a total failure.
But it shows how central this ideology was to her. What did her brother, Friedrich Nietzsche, think about all this? About her anti-Semitism?
Ah, well, this is where the story gets really tragic, and the source emphasizes this divergence. Nietzsche was completely, utterly opposed to his sister's views. He hated anti-Semitism.
How strong.
So strongly, the source recounts, that he refused to even attend her wedding to Bernhard Förster.
He boycotted his own sister's wedding over her husband's anti-Semitism. That's a powerful statement.
A very personal rejection. And the source quotes a letter Nietzsche wrote to her around that time, which is just chillingly prophetic. He told her something like, "You've married the wrong man. He's an anti-Semite. You've committed a folly, and the stain of your mistake will be attached to me for a long time."
The stain of your mistake will be attached to me. Wow. He predicted it.
He really did.
Yeah.
And the source points out how sadly true that became. Because of Elizabeth's actions and her later alignment with the Nazis, people who don't know Nietzsche well often associate him with anti-Semitism. The very thing he despised, attached to his name because of her.
Such a terrible irony. And the source provides evidence for Nietzsche's actual views on Jews, right? Which were the opposite.
Completely the opposite. The source quotes Nietzsche expressing genuine admiration. He wrote that Jewish people were, and this is a direct quote cited in the source, undoubtedly the strongest, toughest, and purest race currently living in Europe.
Strongest, toughest, and purest race. That's astonishingly different from the Nazi view.
Worlds apart. The source explains he admired their resilience, their ability to survive centuries of persecution, their intellectual depth. He saw them as culturally vital, contrasting their strength with what he saw as weakness in German culture at the time.
So he saw resilience, a quality he valued. What about the anti-Semitism rising in Germany in his own time in the 1880s?
He saw it clearly, and he despised it. The source says he viewed it as exactly the kind of herd mentality. He criticized mindless groupthink, irrational hatred, scapegoating. He condemned it explicitly.
Did he say anything particularly strong?
The source includes a really striking quote. Apparently, Nietzsche was so disgusted by the anti-Semitic trends that he said he wished he could just shoot all anti-Semites.
Shoot them. Coming from a philosopher, that's incredibly forceful language. It shows the depth of his rejection of that ideology.
Absolutely. It couldn't be clearer. The source argues this is undeniable proof of the gap between Nietzsche and Nazism. And there's more. His famous break with the composer Richard Wagner.
Right, they were close ones.
Very close. Their friendship fell apart for complex reasons, but the source emphasizes that a major factor was Wagner's increasingly vocal and fervent anti-Semitism, which Nietzsche found repulsive. He ended a crucial friendship, partly over this exact issue.
So the break with his sister, praising Jews, wanting to shoot anti-Semites, breaking with Wagner, the evidence seems overwhelming that he opposed the core of Nazi ideology.
It fundamentally pulls the rug out from under any claim he was a philosophical forerunner to Nazism. But Elizabeth, her role wasn't just her personal views, it was what she did after Nietzsche couldn't speak for himself.
After he became ill in 1889.
Yes, and especially after he died in 1900. She gained control over all his unpublished writings, notebooks, fragments, aphorisms. In 1894, while he was still alive but mentally incapacitated, she founded the Nietzsche Archives in Weimar.
Control of the archives meant control of the legacy, essentially.
Exactly. And the source describes what she did over the next 75 years, until she died in 1935, is basically a systematic manipulation of her brother's work. She controlled who saw the papers, but more importantly, she actively edited them.
Edited them? How?
Rearranging passages, adding things, removing things, changing things before they were published. The source is really blunt about it. It says she didn't care about Nietzsche's actual thoughts. She twisted everything to fit her agenda, her right-wing, nationalist, and anti-Semitic views.
So this wasn't just careful editing, it was deliberate distortion, intellectual sabotage.
That's the strong implication from the source. A prime example is that book, The Will to Power.
The one the Nazis echoed the title of.
Right. The source explains Nietzsche never actually finished or authorized a book with that title. He had the title, he had notes, scattered thoughts under related headings, but it wasn't a coherent manuscript ready to go.
So where did the published book come from?
Elizabeth compiled it after his death. She took all these varied, sometimes contradictory notes, selected bits, arranged them according to her idea of what the book should be, and published that. And that book became a bestseller, seen as a core Nietzschean text.
So a book central to the Nazi interpretation wasn't even really Nietzsche's book, but his sister's construction using his notes.
That's the source's crucial point. It was Nietzsche filtered through Elizabeth. Another example, Nietzsche's own autobiography, Ecce Homo.
Behold the man.
Yes. According to the source, it contained parts critical of Elizabeth and her anti-Semitic husband. So what did she do? She blocked its publication for years until she could go through and cut out the bits she didn't like.
Censoring her dead brother to protect herself and her narrative.
It's pretty shocking. The source stresses that for 35 years, Elizabeth was the gatekeeper and the manipulator. She consistently spun his ideas in the versions she released, giving them this communal, nationalistic, power-focused slant that fit her politics, which eventually aligned closely with Nazism. A huge chunk of what the public got, especially the unpublished stuff, was shaped by her.
It's incredible, but she wasn't entirely alone in creating this Nazi-friendly version, was she? The source mentions other intellectuals got involved.
Right. Elizabeth essentially turned the Nietzsche archives into a kind of meeting place, a hub for right-wing writers, academics, people sympathetic to her views, and later, to Hitler. And under her influence, these intellectuals also worked to interpret Nietzsche in ways that served the regime.
Who were some of these figures the source mentions?
It points to some prominent philosophers who got associated with the archives in this project, particularly Martin Heidegger and Alfred Baumler.
These were major thinkers.
They were indeed. And the source argues that these figures, alongside Elizabeth, deliberately tried to paint Nietzsche as a German nationalist.
Despite all the evidence we just discussed showing he criticized German nationalism.
Exactly. The source calls it an intentional misrepresentation. It suggests figures like Heidegger likely knew about Elizabeth's manipulations, but perhaps used interpretations of Nietzsche partly as a vehicle for their own philosophical ideas, ideas maybe more compatible with the times, presenting them under Nietzsche's banner. The source even calls this intellectual distortion a kind of crime.
A philosophical crime. What about Baumler?
Alfred Baumler seems to have been a true believer, according to the source. He apparently genuinely thought Nietzsche had foreseen Hitler and fascism decades before, and because of this, the Nazi Party specifically recruited him to the archives.
His job was basically to create Nietzsche interpretations that legitimized Hitler.
That's the picture the source paints.
Yeah.
Find the links or manufacture them. And a key part of this was twisting Nietzsche's core concepts.
Okay, how did they twist them? Let's start with the big one. The Übermensch, the superhuman.
Right. So the source explains that for Nietzsche, the Übermensch was more of an individual goal. Spiritual, intellectual self-overcoming, creating new values beyond good and evil, transcending limitations. It was philosophical, maybe psychological.
Not about a specific political leader or a race.
No, definitely not, according to the source's reading. But the Nazi interpreters, the propaganda machine, they flattened it, made it crude, political. They explicitly said over and over, Adolf Hitler is the Übermensch.
The prophesied one has arrived.
Exactly. They pointed to his rise, his assertion of will, his rejection of old morality as they spun it, his conquests. This was proof. He was the embodiment of the will to power too, their version of it.
So they took this complex ideal and just turned it into a political badge for Hitler.
Pretty much. Which brings us to the will to power concept itself. In Nietzsche, it's complex, debated about growth, striving, creativity, overcoming resistance, maybe a fundamental drive, not just brute force.
But the Nazis made it about brute force.
Drastically simplified it, yeah. According to the source, they reduced it to mean basically raw political dominance, military conquest, imposing your will on others. Hitler's aggression, his invasions, that was the will to power in action, they claimed. Might makes right.
Taking a philosophical concept and making it a justification for war.
That's the distortion the source describes. And to make sure only this twisted version got out, the Nazis censored Nietzsche's actual writings.
They cut things out.
The source states they removed parts of his books from schools, from public editions. Specifically, passages praising Jews or criticizing German nationalism. Anything that contradicted the official Nazi interpretation was systematically cut.
Wow. Censor the original to make the fake interpretation stick.
That was the strategy. Control the interpretation, control access to the original words that would disprove it.
Okay, so looking at all this manipulation, the source seems to be building a very strong case that this wasn't influence, it was appropriation. And when you compare Nietzsche's actual views to Nazi ideology, the gaps are huge, right? The source says Hitler walked the opposite path.
Absolutely. This is where the source really drives home the fundamental incompatibility. It lays out key areas where Nietzsche's documented views were just diametrically opposed to Nazism.
Let's run through them again, starting with the starkest, anti-Semitism.
We covered it, but it bears repeating. Nietzsche admired Jews, condemned anti-Semitism passionately. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jews based on that ideology. The source basically asks, how can you claim influence from someone whose core views on your central project are not just different, but utterly opposite and condemnatory? It makes no sense as influence. It only makes sense as propaganda covering up the difference.
Okay, then nationalism.
Nietzsche, deeply critical of German nationalism, saw it as culturally shallow, dangerous.
Nazis.
Extreme aggressive German nationalism was their absolute core belief. Total opposition.
And the herd mentality.
Nietzsche despised conformity, mass movements, political parties demanding blind loyalty. He saw them as suppressing individuality. The Nazis demanded absolute conformity, total loyalty to the party and the Führer. The source suggests Nietzsche would have seen Nazism as the ultimate expression of the herd mentality he loathed, with Hitler as the king of sheep.
His philosophy was almost inherently anti-Nazi in its structure then. What about race and eugenics? That's often where the confusion comes in.
Right, and the source handles this carefully. It acknowledges Nietzsche was thinking about things like inherited traits. He was influenced by Lamarck, by studying ancient hierarchies like the Indian caste system. He did seem to believe in cultivating human excellence, maybe through attention to lineage, a kind of philosophical eugenics aimed at producing higher types, the Übermensch.
Okay, but how is that different from Nazi eugenics?
Crucially different, according to the source. Nietzsche's focus, however problematic some find it, was on fostering excellence, which he seemed to think could potentially emerge from any race or background if the right conditions were met. It wasn't tied to one biological race. The Nazis were obsessed with Aryan racial purity. Their eugenics wasn't about cultivating excellence in general. It was a twisted pseudoscience to justify persecuting, sterilizing, and ultimately exterminating entire groups: Jews, Roma, Slavs, disabled people deemed racially inferior.
So Nietzsche's idea maybe was about cultivating potential greatness wherever it might arise, while Nazi eugenics was about eliminating entire groups based on a racist ideology.
Exactly. The source is clear. Nietzsche did not advocate extermination based on race. Very different goals, vastly different, horrifying methods.
What about democracy? The source mentioned both disliked it.
Yes. And the Nazis latched onto this as a similarity. But again, the reasons were totally different. Nietzsche distrusted democracy because he distrusted the herd, the wisdom of the masses. He thought average people couldn't make wise choices, especially about leaders. It was a philosophical critique based on his view of human nature.
A skepticism about collective judgment.
Right. The Nazis hated democracy simply because it got in the way of their totalitarian control. Elections, opposition parties, limits on power, they couldn't have that. Their rejection was purely pragmatic about seizing and holding absolute power. So, same conclusion, dislike of democracy, but from completely opposite starting points and leading to vastly different alternatives.
World apart again. The source also mentioned the Nazis pointing to critiques of capitalism and the embrace of conflict.
Yeah, more superficial points they'd highlight. The Nazis sometimes criticized capitalism, often linking it to Jewish influence, and Nietzsche also had critiques of modern commercialism. The Nazis glorified war, and they'd twist Nietzsche's ideas about struggle and overcoming into a justification for it. The source says the Nazis would grab these distorted fragments, these superficial overlaps, to fool people while burying the massive fundamental contradictions.
Like anti-Semitism and nationalism.
Exactly. Ignore the elephant in the room, focus on the tiny mouse that might look similar if you squint.
What about German culture?
Nietzsche thought contemporary urban culture was declining, provincial. He wanted a broader European cultural renewal. The Nazis thought German culture was the absolute peak, destined to dominate. Total opposite views.
And Christianity.
Nietzsche famously attacked Christianity for promoting what he saw as weakness, a slave morality. The Nazis sometimes used a warped version of Christianity strategically, mostly to position it as superior to Judaism, as another tool for persecution. Different critiques, different aims entirely.
So looking across all these core areas, anti-Semitism, nationalism, individualism versus herd, race, democracy, culture, religion, the picture the source paints is one of profound antagonism, not influence.
Absolutely. The source argues forcefully the link was pure fabrication. A cynical propaganda campaign using distortion, censorship, and lies, significantly helped along by Nietzsche's own sister and some academics willing to play ball.
And this propaganda was incredibly effective, wasn't it? Because that perception of Nietzsche as somehow Nazi-adjacent still lingers so strongly.
It's a real tragedy of interpretation, as the source puts it. This fiercely individualistic thinker, critical of the very things Nazism embodied, had his legacy captured and twisted to serve a purpose utterly alien to his work.
The source mentioned that saying about Nietzsche dying twice.
Yes, it's quite poignant. The idea circulating in European intellectual circles, first his physical death in 1900, and second his intellectual death, orchestrated by his sister over 35 years as she dismantled and distorted his ideas, especially after he couldn't defend himself. It really captures the damage done.
So, wrapping up the main finding from this source, the common idea of a direct Nietzsche-Hitler philosophical connection, it's a myth, according to this analysis.
A myth built not on substance, but on calculated Nazi propaganda, manipulation by Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, and supportive interpretations from certain intellectuals. It wasn't Hitler reading Nietzsche, it was the Nazis hijacking Nietzsche's name.
But the source adds a layer of nuance, right? It doesn't completely disconnect Nietzsche from everyone involved in Nazism.
Right, that's an important point. The source acknowledges that while Hitler probably wasn't influenced, Nietzsche's ideas were influential in German intellectual circles. And some of the people reading and interpreting Nietzsche, scholars like Heidegger, Baumler, did become Nazis or Nazi sympathizers.
So Nietzsche influenced people who then became Nazis, but that doesn't mean Nietzsche's philosophy caused them to become Nazis or that he guided Hitler.
Exactly. It shows his ideas were part of the complex intellectual currents of the time, and different people took different things from them, sometimes interpreting them through their own pre-existing biases or political leanings. How figures like Heidegger engaged with Nietzsche is a whole complex story in itself. But the source stresses that's different from saying Nietzsche's philosophy is inherently Nazi or that he provided the blueprint for Hitler. It's the crucial difference between ideas being interpreted and sometimes misinterpreted versus ideas directly causing a specific political outcome or guiding a specific leader.
It really makes you think about the power and danger of interpretation, doesn't it? How ideas can be bent.
It does. And that leads to the final, really chilling point the source makes. It connects back to one of Nietzsche's own famous lines.
Which one?
There are no facts, only interpretations.
A statement about subjectivity, how we construct meaning.
Right. And the source argues the Nazis, in the most cynical way imaginable, essentially turned this idea back on Nietzsche himself. By manipulating his work, controlling the narrative, censoring him, they were effectively saying, okay, Nietzsche, you say there are no facts, only interpretations. Fine. Then we, the Nazis, will create our interpretation of you, an interpretation that serves us, and we'll use our power to make damn sure our interpretation becomes the accepted truth, regardless of whatever you actually wrote or meant.
Wow. They weaponized his own philosophical point against him to erase his actual meaning and substitute their propaganda.
That's the chilling implication the source leaves us with. A profound example of how dominant narratives, backed by power, can distort not just history, but the very meaning of ideas. It makes you think, doesn't it? How crucial it is to question interpretations, especially official ones, and how easily complex truths can be buried under convenient lies. It's a lesson that feels incredibly relevant, far beyond just Nietzsche and the Nazis.